I welcome up the first speaker of the Affirmative team to start their team's case.
Alright, so as the first speaker of the affirming team, I'd like to first go over the status quo, what the world is like now, and then I'd like to go over how we can improve the world, make it better by destigmatising hypocrisy, and then go over our main points. First of all, that there are times when people have to be a hypocrite and they shouldn't be shunned for this, and also that destigmatising hypocrisy will allow people to change their mind and make mistakes. So going over the world right now, there is rampant cancel culture prolific throughout Western civilization. You say something that people perceive as hypocritical and you're going to be shunned for this. Hypocritic accusations, they're just flying everywhere and they're not always justified, and they often get blown out of scale, especially with social media being used. People share, and it's so easy behind a device to shun someone for doing something when you weren't there at the time. And not only this, but people are scared to change their mind because they'll face ridiculous backlash for going against what they've always said. So in our world, we can prove that people will be able to be hypocritical when it is absolutely necessary, without their social, mental and emotional health being destroyed, and I'll go into it later what this looks like. We can also prove that people are going to be more open-minded and willing to change their mind if they're wrong because they don't fear being called a hypocrite. Also, we can prove that it will allow you to make mistakes in judgment without being completely cancelled and having your life ruined, which no one deserves, just for one small mistake. Finally, we'd like to say that hypocrisy is not condoned, but it's not blown out of scale as the worst sin ever committed. So moving on to our first point, that there are times when people have to be a hypocrite, and it's not fair to completely cancel them out of the world because of this. For instance, I'd like to look at circumstances that change and different rules for different people. For instance, something may not be appropriate or the right thing to do at one time, but this can change. For instance, let's say warfare. Killing people is never justified in normal life, but in a war or self-defence, this has to be done. For instance, even if you might rally against killing people, if you feel in danger, you might feel like you have to do this to save yourself or your family. And people shouldn't be absolutely blown out of society for doing this. And they shouldn't be shunned for this. People should be able to have to adapt to the situation and survive, because otherwise this is completely unfair. Finally, secondly on this point, there are also different rules for different people. There's differences in your age, your position, where you live, and what is good for you to do. Being called a hypocrite by someone who is in a completely different circumstance and under a different set of rules and things to do, this is very damaging because they don't understand what it's like to be you, and perhaps if your circumstances or rules change, as I said before, then you have to do something which is against what you've said, and we don't always have a choice in this, so you don't want people to be completely destroyed because of this. Our second point is that destigmatising hypocrisy will allow people to change their mind and make mistakes. As humans, we definitely already find it hard enough to change our viewpoint, even if we realise that it is wrong. The added stigma in our culture of this makes it even harder, because it's important to change your mind. It's healthy, and I'll take it later. It's part of expanding your mind. However, if we remove the stigma from what is perceived as hypocrisy, this gives people the freedom to change their mind, even if it goes against what they've said before. This will enhance freedom of speech, because people will feel like they can speak without what they've said before or what other people said, without them being completely shunned for this, thrown out of social media, ignored in their groups, being called a hypocrite. All things which are damaging. I said I'll take it later. Also, the second part of this is that it allows people to make mistakes in judgment with something. When you are, if someone is being hypocritical, it's not always right. However, people do make mistakes. If you make a mistake and go against what you say, this is wrong. But you shouldn't be completely shunned for this. You shouldn't have negative connotations attached, have your life destroyed by this. If you get looked down on for making one hypocritical error, this can have long-lasting damage in your life. And this is what our team wants to avoid. And our world is going to be better because of this, because we're going to allow people to make these errors, know that they're wrong, and get over it. Also, we'd also like to raise that we're not condoning these actions. We're just trying to destigmatise this hypocritical action, whether it's subconscious or conscious. Yeah, take your point.
Do you not think that if there is no stigma at all, people will not change because there is no consequences to them lying about what they are doing?
No, I think that, as I've said before, there's different circumstances where you have to go against what you said. Also, we're not changing the fact whether this is morally wrong or not, we're just changing the whole stigma that's attached to this, the whole shunning of people who have done these things that are wrong. So yeah, we've shown that in our world, people are going to be able to be hypocritical when it's necessary, because there are times where you have to be, with circumstances changing and different rules for different people. And we can prove that people are going to be more open-minded because they're not going to be completely ruined for changing their mind. And that, as we said before, hypocrisy, it's not condoned, it's still wrong, but we're not going to have this whole negative stigma attached, yeah?
Do you not think that if hypocrisy is wrong, there should be at least a tiny bit of stigmatization, where in your world there's no accountability whatsoever?
No, because I don't think that this, that being told that hypocrisy is wrong should be coming from everyone around you laying blame completely on yourself. I think that's also between you, those who know you completely, who aren't just rampantly calling you a hypocrite. I'm proud to stand.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now invite the first speaker of the negative team up to the stand.
The scale of harms the affirmative teams gives is those small little contexts where you're in a friend group, or very niche harms that come from where people need to be a hypocrite to save someone's lives. We tell you that the real harms that occur in this debate are when politicians and world leaders lie and are hypocrites about their actions. That is what will win us this debate. Firstly, on what is the status quo, then our first substantive on why stigma leads to people being less hypocritical, then secondly on why a degree of stigma and hypocrisy is good, then thirdly on the importance of accountability, and Jumana will extend on how youth now have healthier relationships if that's something they want to win on. And my responses will be integrated. So what is the status quo? We tell you instead that there is a degree of stigma in hypocrisy, and this looks like a person who has gossiped about someone's actions and done something that harms that person, in which people confront this person, letting them know that their actions were hypocritical and asking for an apology so that the person who is being harmed has justice, right? It looks like politicians being held accountable by the public and the media for large-scale hypocrisy. For example, when a country like the US condemns invasions but then invades other countries, we think when people call out this kind of hypocrisy, this is the harm that they get, right? They told us that the actual status quo is focused on cancel culture and how it's been blown out of proportion. We tell you that cancel culture is a very small context in which these are just like celebrities who did certain things, and most of these celebrities still stay famous. Like, even if they are cancelled, they still have a fan base. We don't think there's such a big harm to these super rich people. We think when like marginalized communities or like very vulnerable communities are hurt by politicians and governments, that is the harm we got on our side. Okay, so firstly on why the stigma leads to people being less hypocritical. 4 reasons for this. People don't like hypocrites, right? A, this is because they don't like them when people misuse their trust, often for actions that hurt themselves or a third party, in which the principle of someone else being violated has something like that incites people to confront that person. I think secondly, people like transparency, right? They like to know what a group is actually doing. People don't want to know that the government is doing, people want to know that the government is doing exactly what they told you, and I think that's not what they get on their side. Secondly, people around them call them out for either informing or protesting it. This looks like a group of people who confront a hypocritical person and tell them what they did was unfair. It looks like leaders getting backlash when people voted for them but didn't practice what they preached. And thirdly, we think people are less likely to be hypocritical again because people don't like being confronted by a group of co-workers or friends because they face a consequence, right? They had that loss of trust, and that's what people don't like. On their side, where there isn't this stigma, people don't go out and actively look for this hypocrisy, or they don't notice as much because it's so normalized, it's so saturated, where people like become hypocrites more because they face no consequences of those actions. Then fourthly, we tell you that politicians are now aware that the public heavily follows their words and actions, right? So because they want to be in power, they are more careful because they're called out, they realize that the population actually knows what they're doing. And we think that because there's a stigma around it, people avoid that hypocrisy. People don't want to be socially moved. They don't want to removed. They don't want to be socially like mistrusted. They don't want to be mistrusted by friends, so they're less likely to be hypocrites. But even if they do like certain hypocritical things where they tell you the fact that these people are completely shunned out of society, we don't think that's true. Like in the context that they want to win on, that like you're in a family situation or like friend situation, it's likely one little action that might damage the like friendship in the short term because you've lost some trust. But these people can learn and then gain that trust again. It's not like they're just completely shoved out of their like group or the family. I think then that we prove that the stigma actually reduces hypocrisy. So now then on why the degree of hypocrisy on our side is so much better than none at all. Look, in today's debate, I think the biggest harm is the hypocrisy of large powers. So I'm firstly going to talk about the large-scale harms of this, and then I'll talk about the small-scale harms that they're trying to prove. So on the large scale, firstly, I think large powers are more able to hide egregious actions from the public and other powers when there is less of a stigma, but because people are not as active in finding this hypocrisy. We think it looks like companies engaging in greenwashing by promoting their company as environmentally friendly, but releasing huge amounts of carbon emissions or like exploiting their workers. It looks like countries signing the Declaration of Human Rights and violating them. We get this called out on our side of the house. Even if these people do eventually get called out on their side of the house because people don't like when like countries do bad things, I think we get this faster because the stigma increases people's activeness in searching and identifying for that hypocrisy, because hypocrisy on their side also becomes so saturated. There's so much hypocrisy that you can't keep up with it all. We think on our side, when there's a stigma, less people do it, which means that you're able to call out those really egregious harms that comes from countries and politicians lying so much. On the smaller scale then, firstly, it looks like people taking the easy way out on their side because they don't face the consequences of those really contradictory actions, right? They told us that this allows people to make mistakes and like to help them expand their mind and the ability for them to change their mind. We think that firstly, in the status quo, people also make these mistakes, right? On a small scale, most people have probably done some hypocritical action. We tell you that they are not shunned for these small things, and actually we're going to flip this point and we tell you that we actually allow them to recognize the mistake because the stigma allows for these people to be called out in the first place. So they can recognize that they actually made a mistake and they can improve from that. On their side, when everyone does it, it becomes normalized to be a hypocrite. People don't really care, which means people don't realize it's a mistake to like act out or harm someone when they said they wouldn't. Secondly, on our side, people don't do the same thing again, or there are further incentivizers to follow the actions of their words. This is because people want to feel a part of the group like at any given time, so they don't want to be portrayed as a hypocrite for that short term. Comparatively, more people are hypocrites on their side when it becomes socially acceptable. B, we tell you there's a group of people who may have been unaware of the hypocrisy and feel like a certain level of guilt when they're told on our side. They're able to apologize to the victim that they actually feel bad for. On their side, this person doesn't recognize they've made this mistake in the first place. The impacts of this is that we literally get less hypocritical actions to take place and cause actions to be predictable, because that's what people said they would do. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Do you not think that the actions committed by these groups that you met, by these actors that you mentioned, speak far more widely than whatever lying or hypocritic words they've spoken?
Yeah, we think that's the exact harm we're trying to prove in the debate, that there's such large-scale harms that come from these small words that they say. The fact that they have this power to influence so many people and have actions that go against so many people, this is the huge harm we're talking about on our side. We also tell you there's a massive harm on Affirmative because the hypocrisy becomes so saturated, right? less people will protest actions that are hypocritical, like the government. This means that the government might not be called out, so governments that actually harm a lot of people are not recognised for the harms they cause, in which they might be re-elected because less people know about this. Okay, thirdly then, on the importance of accountability, 3 reasons for this. Even if you believe that no one becomes less hypocritical, we win this debate by proving there's better accountability, right? Firstly, because people have a way to stand up for what has wronged them. This uniquely happens on our side because it's a stigma, so a group of people will stand with the person who has been wronged. When it's normalised, people will kind of stand with a marginalised group when they've been harmed by the government because they're like, this happens all the time. On our side, when there's a stigma, people will actually stand with this group. They're more likely to call out this hypocrite. Secondly, there are consequences, right? They are imposed. They might not be re-elected. It looks like maybe losing a friend for a short term. Or thirdly, people know early because a leader has been hypocritical and harmed many people. I think on our side, when we prove that politicians and world leaders are held accountable, it outweighs any of the material on these small scale, like very niche times where you can save someone's life with being a hypocrite.
I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome the second speaker of the Affirmative team.
Hello. First of all, I just want to hit in straight with a bit of rebuttal here. You guys talked briefly about accountability and that when you remove accountability, you get these sort of imbalances. Now, we, as the affirming side, we don't condone these sort of actions, and we are removing the stigma of subconsciously or consciously doing or saying something that contradicts you. Now I'm going to move on to my substantives. First of all, it gives the individual right to free speech, which Natalie touched on. I'm going to expand a lot more on that. Second up, I'm going to talk about current negative connotations on hypocrisy don't allow you to change your mind and the idea of critical thinking and open-mindedness in today's society. Third point here, by allowing hypocrisy and in a world where it's not as destigmatized, it'll mean people feel safer and less isolated to come out and actually express their opinions in modern society. Number 4, I'm going to come out and talk about that circumstances change. Circumstances change in society, which means that we should be able to move on and adapt as so say you say one thing might not necessarily be that in 5 years' time. Now then 5th up, I'm going to talk about the principle of human mind today. Okay, let's just come back to freedom of speech here. By allowing freedom of speech and this kind of whole concept of freedom of speech, it's a saying that we loosely throw out in society, but let's mechanize that for you here today. So, when you talk about freedom of speech, it doesn't necessarily condone the actions of certain individuals. It more talks about that when you are able to discuss something without being absolutely attacked by the society here.
Fine.
Then I also just want to touch on a little bit about COVID-19. I'm sure we remember our ex-Prime Minister, was it? Chippy? Chippy went for a little bit of a stroll during COVID. He was very contradictory of himself there. He went out, sure he got a little bit ridiculed, but it is his own right to do what he wants. He has his own ability to express himself in the society. As a leader, sure, you might try and argue that he should be a role model for society, but at the end of the day, it is up to himself to be able to go out and do what he wants. Okay, moving on to my second point regarding current negative connotations of hypocrisy don't allow you to change your mind. And this is about sort of critical thinking and stuff. If you aren't able to learn and grow as a human by making mistakes, you have to make mistakes in society, otherwise you can't move on. Now, you have to admit that you're wrong. So you might say something a little bit hypocritical in this world, and then you come back and you go, oh, actually, you know what, that was incorrect. Yes, you are allowed to make mistakes. You are able to be held accountable. Now, the next slide over here talked about these large and huge sort of implications regarding governments and policies, which at the end of the day might be incorrect, but you have to be able to know that you can adapt and move on, and decisions can be made. Now, when you are adapting this sort of critical thinking sort of mindset and mentality, you kind of have to learn that mistakes are critical and it does not allow people to feel as who they are. Okay, moving on here regarding isolation and people feeling kind of less safe. So if you're being contradicted if you're contradicting and sort of, you know, in this world of hypocrisy where, you know, you're admitting something and all of that,
Point.
and you're being sort of destigmatized by this sort of thing, it makes you feel a bit like in your shell, and it means you don't want to actually come out and
Point.
express your views. If the next side here wants to talk about politicians and trying to get this whole sort of government thing, the whole point of democracy is building on this foundation that people are able to express their own personal views on society
Point.
as a whole. Now I'm just going to move on to my next point regarding like the fact that circumstances do change, right? So we saw that in 2019 when the COVID-19 pandemic first came out in late December, there was a lot of fear-mongering amongst certain things, and we especially heard in early 2020 I should say, with Donald Trump sort of coming out and being all, you know, oh, let's take bleach and stuff. At this time, he might have thought that, you know, this might have been true, but at the end of the day, he later learned that this wasn't, and this mistake was rectified, and he sort of started supporting this larger global movement which saw us all come together as a society. Now, next up I'm going to come on to the principle of our human mind and our own human intellect. We as humans need to develop these sort of neuro pathways in our mind that are able to connect us all, and it's the idea of, you know, this principle regarding the fact that humans need to be able to develop and move on. I'll take the POI now if you would like. If you don't want it, it's all good.
Do you know? Okay, go on.
Okay. When you told us about the COVID-19 politician, don't you think that nobody is stopping him from going out? He's just facing consequences for hypocritical actions?
100%, he's definitely facing his sort of consequences regarding these hypocritical actions, but it's this ability for him to recognise that he is able to go out and do what he wants. Anyone can go out and do what they want in this sort of world. It's this kind of, you know, justice, miscarriage of justice that this team wants to talk about here. I also just want to briefly touch on this sort of idea. I'm going to briefly just come back to this whole kind of idea that negative connotations like allow you to change your mind in critical thinking, because I believe I didn't touch as strongly on that as I thought I should. When we grow up in a world at like 5 years old, you're born, right? And you're not born at 5 years old. At 5 years old, you know, you start to develop. You're born at 0 years old, I'd like that clarified. And as you develop and kind of grow up, you learn from people around you, you learn from your sort of like peers, you learn from your parents, and you need to be able to adapt and develop this sort of critical thinking mindset, you should say. And it's kind of this idea that we in society kind of have this negative thought around if you do something absolutely incorrect, then you can't move on. If these guys say that you can't do anything wrong at all in society, then how are students and peers going to be able to move on and actually develop and grow when at the end of the day they're being absolutely shut down for every single point that they make? Absolutely ridiculous in my eyes and our affirming side. I also just want to come back to this kind of like the status quo model that we're seeing at the moment. Like we're seeing this huge prolific kind of role of cancel culture in our environment, and we're seeing these rise of protests and these rise of kind of democracy with people, you know, wanting to express their right to protest, which is 100% fair. Totally agree with that on the affirming side here. But it's this kind of idea that anything you say, like if you support something on the other side of the movement, you're actually shut down, and this cancel culture negatively impacts us in this kind of like world that we move on. And like if you're being shut down for every single thing you say, then how can we move on in this kind of government democracy world? I'll take the point now if you would like.
Do you not think that if you express an opinion because you believe in it, that's just not hypocrisy, and that is like something encouraged on our side of the house to say what you think?
To say what you think, kind of sure, that is regarding a little bit of hypocrisy in there, but it's this kind of thing that you shouldn't be destigmatized and attacked for that. I'm just going to come back to this kind of bit, like in debating, right? We are all kind of the biggest sort of hypocrites regarding this thing that we come up here, we say things that we necessarily don't believe in, and if we are absolutely, if we're destigmatized and negatively attacked for what we say, that's just a world where I don't feel safe coming up here. I feel kind of in my shell, and I don't want to be like that at all. I just want to also touch on the fact regarding like these sort of benefits on our side of the house that we see on the affirming side of the house, with regarding like someone's actions don't align with like what they say and kind of this hypocrisy being destigmatized. So benefits we see a huge more amount of people coming out and expressing their own right to believe. We see a huge numbers of uptake in like voting numbers, and this kind of like idea that people are able to come out and express themselves and get in amongst democracy, because at the end of the day that's what it's all about. We next up see this kind of development of human mind and this kind of idea that we can move on and we're able to grow our minds and think critically. And then we also see an absolute change in the status quo, which I'm being completely honest with you, the status quo model is absolutely appalling, and it's something that we shouldn't be recognised for, because the status quo is something where everyone is feeling attacked and absolutely harmed. And that's, ladies and gentlemen, as why I'm proud to stand. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome the second speaker of the engagement.
The world of which the affirmative side wants us to live in is a world where politicians can say something and then consistently do the exact opposite. It is a world where they will try and convince the public that they are doing exactly what will be benefiting them and then taking actions which is directly against everything that they have been preaching. Every single harm we have on their side is extremely more impactful than the very minimal, very niche harm that they have on our side. Okay. Three main things in my speech today. Firstly, on who is actually the hypocrites and who are actually the ones being harmful in this debate. Secondly, on which side actually gets people to change. And then thirdly, I'm going to split and talk about why, on a smaller scale, the youth have healthier friendships and just grow up overall to be better people. Now, first of all, I feel like it is really important to frame what even is hypocrisy and why it is really harmful. Now, it is relatively clear that the affirmative side has confused hypocrisy with actually explaining your own opinion. Their entire case relies on the fact that once we destigmatize hypocrisy, everyone's going to suddenly have freedom of speech, right? Everything they have told us is that in a world where there is stigma, no one is allowed to go up and say their opinion. No one's allowed to actually say what they are thinking. Now, first of all, that is just not what hypocrisy is, right? Hypocrisy is when you get up and say you're doing something, but then not actually do something. It is going up and saying you think something and actually be thinking the complete opposite. Hypocrisy simply just isn't freedom of speech. Hypocrisy is its own separate thing. On our side of the house, we actually encourage freedom of speech in the way where we tell people to actually go up and express what they're truly thinking, where we actually shun people from society if they give an opinion which they don't actually believe in. This is actually really important in the debate because we are the side who actually shows a more authentic society where everyone can actually express their own personal opinions that they actually believe in and not something that they feel pressured into it. Once we have stigma alongside hypocrisy, we actually see that people are more likely to then actually say what they are really doing. It is our side that gets less hypocrisy. Okay then, firstly, on who is actually a hypocrite. On their side of the house, they have given us a very niche harm for the people who will be the people who absolutely have to be a hypocrite to save themselves from devastating consequences. Now, firstly, why is this never actually a real thing? Why does this harm just not exist? Because firstly, there is simply no circumstance where you have to lie about the actions you are doing. There is no circumstance where you have to be doing something and then get up and lie about it, right? And even in the case that this is something that does have to happen, it is a very small harm that is outweighed by the extremely devastating impacts of having politicians and corporations telling people that they are doing something and doing the exact opposite. This harm is simply so much more impactful and affects so many more people than the three people on their side of the house, which have to save themselves from whatever. We also see that hypocrisy just doesn't apply to doing something for necessity, right? If someone has to do something to survive, this isn't hypocrisy for the reasons that it is people know that you are doing this to be surviving. People know that you are doing this to actually get by. If you don't have to be lying about the actions you are doing, because if you have to do it to survive, it is likely that you're not doing something wrong because it is a circumstance which has led you to actually doing this. There is no need to be hypocritical, so therefore this harm just does not exist on their side of the house. The likelihood of them lying about doing something means that the thing that they were originally doing is likely already something that is very harmful. Anyways, if you buy every single thing they said about this point, we still win when we tell you that politicians are so much more likely and corporations are so much more likely to have devastating impacts on a lot more people. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Do you deny that the people have done things to survive and then being completely shunned for it?
There is never an instance where someone has been shunned for trying to survive, right? If a person does something because the alternative is them not waking up the next day, it is unlikely that society is going to hate on them for trying to make it in a world, right? It's just simply untrue that someone's going to be shunned for trying to make it to the next day. And even if you do think that they're going to be shunned, we still think that the stigma is really good in the way that we actually hold a lot more powerful people to account. So with every, like, at their best case, we still win on the idea that politicians do not get held accountable. Secondly, on which side gets more people to change, and with this I'm taking the point of about isolation and how you feel like you're in your own shell. Now they tell us that on their side of the house they get more freedom of speech and they allow people to change their minds. Okay, why do they firstly not allow people to change their minds? Because once there is no stigma, there actually is no consequences. There is no incentive that actually allows you to be making change, right? Like if you do something, if you like be a hypocrite and no one calls you out for it, it is unlikely then that you're gonna change your mind out of the goodness of your heart. Once there is a stigma, you're gonna be a hypocrite, you're gonna be called out for it, and then what happens? You're unlikely going to do it again because there is a stigma, because you're being held accountable, and because there are consequences. They tell us that they're gonna get more freedom of speech on their side of the house, and like this is like the whole point of democracy with their idea of like in COVID-19. Now firstly about the democracy thing, this is just not democracy, because democracy is ensuring that citizens actually have a right to vote for their government without being lied to about what their government is truly like is actually doing. And secondly, it is also like not freedom of speech in the way that hypocrisy just isn't freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is like you allowed to say whatever you think, right? So hypocrisy just isn't that, because you are saying something you do not believe in. Like once they promote hypocrisy, they're actually promoting the end of freedom of speech, where everyone's just lying about what they truly believe in. The difference between, there's like a very clear difference between a controversial opinion and actually lying about what we truly do. On our side of the house, we encourage you to actually be saying what you think. We encourage controversial opinion. We encourage discussions without being shunned, because it's what you truly believe in. This is just so much more important because we actually see people not lying about their true actions and keeping everything inside. Second on this point, they also told us something about isolation, about how you feel like you're stuck in your own world. Now, why is this actually a really temporary impact? So in a world where like you get like a bit of public shame for being a hypocrite, this is actually like a good thing in the way that you're gonna know you did something wrong and you're actually then going to make a change. Like this like isolation at their best case, where you're going to feel like you're in your own world for a little bit, and then you're going to want to take action to be re-accepted into society and overall be a less hypocritical person. Finally then, I'm going to split and talk about why on our side of the house, even in the really small scale, the youth actually have healthier friendships and grow up to be better people. Now, what does hypocrisy look like within the youth? It looks like people gossiping about someone and then being really nice to them to their face. It looks like someone doing certain things like vaping and then preaching like exercise and health. Now, why then on our side of the house do we actually have healthier and better friendships? So first of all, the youth, they just overall really want to fit in and have friends. When a stigma exists, they are likely going to be actively working to be truthful and to be honest, as to not be like cut out by others, right? And on our side of the house, at the worst, it is likely that backbiting is encouraged, and at their best, it is ignored, and people can still get away with being an overall really horrible person. This then leads to unhealthy friendships in the way that everyone is going to be gossiping or lying about doing something, and then actually like shaming other people for doing the exact same, leading to just overall really unhealthy friendships. We also see that there's a really bad impact on their mental health and their future in the way that they cannot call people out for hypocrisy, since it is normalized, and no one is sympathizing with a victim of hypocrisy, and like overall they're just like no one's gonna be siding with them if they are hurt by this. And it's likely that in the future they're going to be going to negative friendships and like overall toxic work environments in the future, and they're just gonna screw over their lives because there was never the idea of there being hypocrisy being bad. We also see they grow up to be better people in the way that they got held accountable once as a kid. They're not likely going to be doing it again. They're also going to be calling out people for being hypocritical, and they're just not gonna let lies slide. The impacts of this is they're just overall more honest people, and they're gonna be calling people out. They're actually gonna have like less hypocrisy as a whole happens within people, as it's been ingrained in them since they were children that hypocrisy is bad and they should be telling what they truly believe in as a child. This is why we're very proud to do it.
I thank the speaker for their speech and now welcome the third speaker of the Affirmative team.
I'll just remind teams that you're only allowed to give POIs between the first and the 7th minute.
Is the principal idea of hypocrisy in today's current society objectively fair for civilization, and is it being truthful to the principles stated by the opposing team? I would like to think not. This is why we would like to believe a world with hypocrisy, or prefer a world with hypocrisy being destigmatised. I'd first like to briefly clarify some of the heinous counteractions that the opposing team have brought along today, but I would then like to go and focus on what the three main clash points I would believe this debate would be characterised around, and I believe this is the effect on actors of hypocrisy. I believe another point being clarifying what the actual effects of hypocrisy are, and under whose model are the effects of this reduced, and moreover what actually hypocrisy looks like, which has not been clearly defined, I think, in this debate. So I'm going to settle this once and for all now as I speak. I'd just like to go into some brief rebuttal before I initiate the substantive portion of my case. Namely, one key aspect that has been pivotal throughout the case is the idea that hypocrisy is pivotal in the change and behaviour of large actors. They mentioned something like the US government, something regarding invasions, like the incessant invasions of the US Brits in Vietnam, Iraq, or numerous invasions. What makes you think, even if people do realise, say, the hypocrisy of the US in calling out terrorism and proceeding to bomb millions of... no, thank you. Even if you call out the hypocrisy on this, what makes you think, even in a world where this is stigmatised, what makes you think this actually has any effect on these significantly large actors you mentioned? If you look historically, for example, and even in maybe small cases, say for example in say the district council, or maybe even say like, yeah, g'day.
Do you, on your side of the house, do you prefer a world where people just simply ignore the hypocrisy of governments and don't even do the slightest thing where on our side of the house they're actually protesting and holding governments to account?
This has nothing to do with ignoring hypocrisy. Moreover, it's to do with mainly the destigmatisation of what being hypocritic means. And this is where it ties into a main structure of our point, that we are not, what they have failed to realise throughout their bogus arguments is that we are not condoning people's actions, but rather we are trying to degrade the stigmatisation that worsens people's freedom to speak on something, or worsens people's social isolation on something, based on the subconscious counteraction of the argument. And what do we think this looks like? Well, we're not trying to condone the actions of individuals who appear to be hypocritic. No, thank you. Whether that be MP for Dunedin David Clark driving around Dunedin while criticising people. We're not trying to condone, say, someone escaping COVID regulations, or say someone on a more extreme example, the implementation of Aryan race theory in the Second World War. We're not trying to condone these actions. We're simply trying to destigmatise the idea that hypocrisy has the individuals involved. And what do we think the stigma creates? We think the stigma in our current status quo is being prevalent through the structures of rampant cancel culture. No, thank you. Rampant cancel culture, which is prevalent, and that stems from the idea that the group with the current balance of power in society, and what it looks like this in the current Western civilization, is effectively, when claims of hypocrisy are made, they usually favour the largest actor prevalent, and even when minor claims of hypocrisy can be made against the largest actor, we find they have very little effect. For an example, claims of hypocrisy made by Māori or by the Kingitunga movement after 1858 to the Native Land Court, even though clear hypocrisy was acknowledged, this had very little effect on the imposition of the significant power held by the colonial powers in the constabulary post-1840, or even in America with the effect of the hippie movement on actually influencing the Nixon administration and their decisions in Vietnam. We don't believe that what they've stated, their main point has been that the effects of someone being realised as a hypocrite actually affects their behaviours. We believe, yes, that occurs on a very small scale, but we only believe this has minor effects, which I'll take a point of information.
Since hypocrisy is not something to be condoned, do you not think there should be consequences, and this only comes when there is a stigma?
We believe there are consequences of hypocrisy, but we don't believe they only arise particularly from a stigma. We believe the idea that someone is counteractionary against their own principles. We believe this is something wrong, but it's also something that's usually intentionally realised anyway. But I would like to reiterate our main point over this irrelevance here, that what we are seeing on this side of the house, the main point has been on the freedom of speech. We've heard some misinterpretations on both sides of what actually this is, so I'd like to clarify what this means. how do we recognise, how does the freedom of speech and therefore the freedom of relations and the improvements this has between helpful dialogue and healthy discussion between people improve? We believe this improves as individuals, yes, now have the freedom, particularly in subconscious mistakes, even when we take this in social settings, the freedom to make these mistakes, but without being immensely stigmatised and being profiled based on the consequences of their mistake, and therefore being socially isolated from these mistakes. And then as a result of being isolated, being disengaged, disembursed, as we look at various groups that occurred politically, I'd like to think groups were particularly with loss of, who are marginalised in terms of their voice and an ongoing power structure, wherever that is globally.
Point.
Yes.
Do you not think that you encourage discussion more once you allow people to have freedom of speech rather than get up and lie about what they want?
When have I ever questioned the ability for someone to have freedom of speech? This has hypocrisy does not mean the idea of lying. This has nothing to do with the idea of telling a lie. It simply means stating something which goes against your own actions. They believe it is objectively a lie. It's not a lie. It's doing something which is counteractory to your own stated philosophy. It's not a lie, and that's a bogus claim. This is why I ignore this whole material of the consequences of lying. We believe we can eliminate them simply because it does not fit within the frames of the motion. We believe that this material is likely irrelevant, and it's likely symmetrical on both cases. We believe these are patterns of human behaviour that are likely going to be true. That people always going to be discouraged from lying and these Hippocratic ideals normally. People are going to be discouraged once this is realised. But we don't believe that the stigma associated with this is actually beneficial to the individuals involved, and we do not believe this is. We believe this has partly contributed to the rise of the negative effects of rampant cancel culture, such as the isolation and prevalence of people's particular views, contributing to increasing polarisation and division throughout societies. This is why we believe, on our side of the house, we've won the clash point fundamentally of our effects on actors. We believe, while they have realised people may have some resistance and this may unify people over a given time, we don't believe it has any real social consequences except in marginal settings. You know, you might be able to call out the council for hypocrisy, you might be able to change the winter grazing laws marginally, but we don't believe on the immense scale that they've talked about on influencing the political behaviours of the IDF or the US government, or even going back to the Viet Cong in the US. We don't believe this may unify people, but it's immensely inconsequential. We don't believe this rather creates internal political division within these countries, and while it creates unhealthy discourses, people become increasingly more polarised, and it creates the exact conditions for the proliferation of emotionally based politics that we've seen throughout New Zealand, but also we saw for New Zealand throughout the Ardern administration, but also in the wider world over the past years based on these events. And we see this emotionalism in politics, this political McCarthyism created by the opposing side has been a detriment to society, and this is why, adjudicators, we have been victorious in this debate. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now invite the third speaker of the negating team.
A world in which hypocrisy is normalized is a world in which vulnerable, innocent people face harms with no voice to actually speak out, with no mechanism to actually stop these actions. We tell you that when there's a stigma against hypocrisy, hypocrisy does not occur to the same extent that it does when there's no stigma. We tell you that that is debate-winning material because these vulnerable groups who have no mechanism of protecting themselves when hypocritical groups are able to go against them. We tell you that that's debate-winning material. But even if we don't win on decreasing hypocrisy, we tell you that we can still win on increasing accountability for hypocritical people and groups. At the top of my speech then, I'd like to start with some weighing. I think that the most important thing here is that decreasing hypocrisy alone is debate winning. On two different reasons. A, on scale, right? We tell you that it's at the smaller level here. Every single friend group is just more trustworthy and closer. People tend to like each other more, and there's just less hatred around hypocritical people. But at the actually important level, which we should really care about in this debate, we tell you that politicians and institutions no longer get away with literally committing crimes that harm and kill millions of people. We tell you that that is all we need to do to prove to win this debate, right? We tell you that secondly, these vulnerable people are protected because the stigma acts as a mechanism to prevent society from accepting, or worse, normalising these harms to these vulnerable groups who don't have a voice to speak out on their own. We tell you that the stigma allows society to protect these people. So then, the first thing to talk about here is on whether or not we actually decrease hypocrisy, but more importantly, whether or not that's actually a benefit. So the most important thing we tell you here is that these really big actors like governments, like institutions, can say one thing, be trusted because people tend to trust these really big institutions. We gave Meeks at first about that, which faced no response. But then follow up those words with actions that contradict this, and they're able to get away with this. I think that the stigma against hypocrisy actually causes these actors to change their actions for a couple of reasons. A, people of the public don't like hypocrites, right? We told you this at first. Trust is so important within governments and stuff. When you've got no trust that the government's actually doing what they're saying, we say that that's when you lead to hatred, and that's what the government needs to protect. Then their main incentive is to be re-elected. If the public hates them for being hypocrites, they don't get re-elected. But B, these institutions rely on the public supporting them. If they do things that people will go against, it shows that they just lose power, and again, it's against their own interests. So then to engage with Nick's material on times when people have to be hypocrites, I think it's important to note that it's just not particularly important in the debate because it's just a really low scale harm. They never really engage with our material about the millions of people who are literally being killed or oppressed. And so I think that at this stage of the debate, we've already won on that regard. But the first thing we hear though is that circumstances affect hypocrisy. Firstly, we hear that circumstances don't always affect what people think of you in terms of hypocrisy, right? We told it's a pretty specific thing. There's a difference between standing against killing innocent people in in a vulnerable group through genocide and self-protection when someone's literally trying to kill you. Those are totally different things, and that's just not hypocrisy if you do one but not the other. Secondly, even if circumstances do affect hypocrisy, we show that the level of backlash depends on the level of hypocrisy. If it's just a really minor relation, not that many people are going to care that much. But thirdly, we tell you that people are understanding. They can see your scenario. If they realize that you would had to kill someone, for example, in order to save your life, they're gonna get that. They're gonna know that they would have literally done the same thing, so you're not gonna face any backlash in that regard. But fourthly, note that this entire harm is reliant on the rare scenario of being forced to go against your core values and hence being cancelled and not having freedom of speech. A, we tell you that most people never get into these scenarios. It's just really rare that you're about to be mugged and have to kill the person in order to save yourself. But B, we tell you that most people don't have the followings to be cancelled, and the people that do are probably really rich and privileged anyway, so we're fine with them facing some level of backlash for their actions. If that means that vulnerable groups and people who are actually harmed in this debate have some sort of support mechanism. The next thing we hear is that they're not changing whether or not hypocrisy is morally wrong. They're just preventing the social backlash. Firstly, we tell you that when a stigma actively prevents these immoral, unjust actions from occurring on both small and large scales, you just necessarily benefit the people who are harmed by hypocrisy. So we tell you that if they agree that hypocrisy is bad and we've proven that hypocrisy decreases. I think that like both sides agree that that's quite an important quite an important impact in the debate, and that's like necessarily debate winning. But secondly, we showed that like removing the stigma, which is the comparative on their side, naturally leads to normalization. If no one's calling anyone out for being a hypocrite, people just accept it and move on with their lives. We showed that that's when these vulnerable groups are harmed to like a considerably worse scale, because there's no like support mechanism. Like even if they try to call out the people that are harming them, they don't have the voice to actually make any change in that regard, because they're so oppressed in society. That's only worse under AF. The next thing here is on like people changing their minds and being open-minded. The first thing we hear is that it's really hard to change your viewpoint. Firstly, we tell you that people have every right and every ability to change their viewpoints on either side. We tell you that hypocrisy isn't just changing your viewpoint, it's a matter of not changing your actions, right? We tell you that if you're saying one thing and acting like in a contradictory manner, that's hypocrisy. We tell you that like realizing your mistakes and changing your opinion just isn't isn't the definition of hypocrisy. But secondly, we tell you it's like if it really is hard to change your viewpoint, you still have control of your actions. You don't need to be a hypocrite in that regard, because you can always just like do the right thing, or like the thing that you actually believe. The next thing we hear is that removing the stigma leads to increased freedom of speech. Note that this was like the thing that AF wants us to weigh most important in this debate, and we don't agree with that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we tell you that like freedom of speech is literally just symmetrical on either side. People can say what they want, like obviously within reason and stuff.
Point of information.
On either side, there's nothing stopping that. People have the right to have beliefs on either side. So I think like that symmetricalness immediately removes any harm. But secondly, we show that even if like they do somehow get increased freedom of speech, that's not always a good thing. We show that that's when that leads to like societal chaos. That's when like vulnerable groups face hatred and harm, but don't have the like mechanisms to protect themselves. The third thing we hear is that like it allows people to make mistakes. Firstly, we tell you that since you can like change your viewpoint or realize your actions, like on either side, you can still like change your actions either way, and like I already covered that earlier. And the fourth thing we hear is that you get the right to do what you want when there's no stigma. Firstly, we tell you that like laws and basic common sense dictate your actions. Like you can't just do whatever you want because there's no stigma. But secondly, we tell you that the actions you make are better when there's a stigma, because it's actually a mechanism to make you think twice about doing something hypocritical. You're more likely to actually like make a better decision, and we tell you that like people don't get away with horrible things. So since we proved that we decrease hypocrisy, we win this debate. But even if we don't, how do we still win on increasing accountability for people who are hypocritical? We tell you that the importance of like accountability comes in a couple of ways. And I'm just whipping material here because this didn't face enough response. Firstly, we tell that people have a way to stand up against people who are hypocritical when there's a stigma. You have power in numbers when everyone agrees that hypocrisy is bad. You can like work against these like large institutions that generally have lots of power. But secondly, there are consequences to your actions. People obviously don't want to face these consequences because it's like leads to them not having power and stuff. So we tell that like that's enough to decrease people from like being hypocritical so proud to get.
I thank the speaker for this speech. As customary, we now switch to speaking orders. I welcome the leader of the negative team to finish the team's case.
The Affirmative case flipped from second to third about the freedom of speech point, which was literally half of their case, in which they told us that hypocrisy infringes on like people's freedom of speech for having that stigma, and then they tell us that actually it's an absurd argument. I think this was really confusing, so we'll deal with both of these in my leaders. Firstly, on what is hypocrisy and who are the hypocrites. Secondly, on the harms on a large scale, and thirdly, on the harms of on a small scale, which is what they're trying to win in today's debate. So firstly, on what is hypocrisy and who are the hypocrites, and what actually is hypocrisy and how it manifests in both worlds. Firstly, their main push is that people have to be a hypocrite to save their life. Note, they literally gave you no no mechanization or examples in which this occurs, but say when somebody actually has to save someone's life, we tell that these people won't be called out because people recognize that they are in a life and death situation. People aren't going to shun people or like hate on them for the fact that literally saved their lives because they know that that's what they would do in that same circumstance. Secondly, I think this point weighs very little in this debate, given that we gave you so many impacts on a large scale and how this changes people doing it. Because I think if with or without this, someone without the stigma, somebody is going to be a hypocrite and save someone's life. We don't see how there's a tangible change in that sense on either side of the house. Secondly, they told you that hypocrisy violates people's freedom of speech, right? Firstly, they gave us their like chippy violating the isolation laws. I think this proves our harms by politicians doing exactly what they told they told people to self-isolate and then did the opposite, in which people don't want to follow these laws because they're like, well, we don't trust our politicians because they're not doing the laws they imposed on us. And then thirdly, they told us the point of democracy, right? Because people get to say and do as they want. Firstly, we tell you that this is literally not democracy. Democracy is ensuring that citizens have the right to vote and know what their government is doing. So when we're able to call out hypocrisy, we get democracy in the first place. Then the fourth push is that hypocrisy happens when somebody changes their minds. This is also not hypocrisy because somebody is having a shift in opinion, right? Even if it's a massive like contradictory shift, we tell you that hypocrisy is normally saying you're going to be good or saying that like you're going to do something good and then doing something that actually harms a large group of people. We think this weighs out into today's debate. Secondly, on the harms of a large scale, right? The main push here is that if it doesn't change the actions of these people. We gave you so many reasons as to why powers and politicians are incentivized to reduce their hypocrisy or be more careful about hypocrisy at first and down the line. It's because they want to be re-elected. And even if you buy none of that material here, I think our material on accountability still stands. The fact that people are made aware and they can just put this government or this party out of politics because they feel like they're being mistrusted. This large-scale material didn't face enough response. We gave you so much weighing from Jumana and Nikash about how politicians harming people is such a significant amount of people, how world leaders harming people, such a significant amount of people, the marginalized communities who are already very vulnerable, being told they are going to they're promised some sort of thing from the government and then given the complete opposite. We think that's the harm where people are lied to and these people have no mechanism without any stigma to have people support them and go against the government and make sure they aren't re-elected. Thirdly then, on the harms of the stigma on the small scale, and this is what they try to win on. Throughout this debate, the AV team hasn't engaged sufficiently on the large scale harm, so I think we're going to also try win on the small scale. Firstly, they told us on a small scale that people feel isolated because they are shunned. We told you down the line that people are not shunned for minor hypocrisy, right? But you might, in some instance, have a loss of trust from a friend when you gossip about them behind their back and now you're acting really nice to them and they find out. We think this is a short-term loss, which you can't just destroy years of friendship or years of relationships with your family, right? This is a short-term thing. We think you can learn from these mistakes. The main push was also that someone could learn from these mistakes. We flip this because on their side, you have very saturated hypocrisy where people don't call out this because it happens so often, whereas on our side, people actively look out for it, they're able to catch it, and then people can learn from the mistakes. On our side, we're so proud to oppose because we get the change for vulnerable people.
I thank the speaker for this speech, and now welcome the leader of the Affirmative teams.
Alright, I'd like to go over some of the differences of the arguments in this debate and prove that the negating team is doing absolutely nothing to change the world as it is and improve it, whereas we're going to have benefits both on we're going to have benefits involved. So first of all, we've seen a bit about how the world is right now, and they've said that their side will decrease hypocrisy and increase accountability of people. However, they're not going to change a thing. They're just saying that stigma is going to do this. They're not changing anything in the world right now. And so whereas we are putting the change in that will improve people's mental health and ability to change their mind. And note that on our side, hypocrisy is still wrong, but not blown out of proportion with this huge stigma attached. And we believe that it is mainly the small scale that is affected in this case rather than the large scale. So there's been a few points raised which have been quite symmetrical. For instance, about democracy, we believe that on either side of the house, we've proven that democracy is not going to change more or less on one side. It's very symmetrical, so that point is quite irrelevant. On the negating side of the house, they've talked about people are going to stand up for what is wrong and there'll be consequences for wrongdoers. This isn't affecting people in the world right now. Protests and stigma, people aren't listening. This is very symmetrical because they can't prove that they're going to stop people doing hypocrisy. And actually, we come out of this better because we don't have people just blowing up at people for being hypocrites. Nothing is changing, and we believe this will possibly encourage people to seek other options to talk to to change things. They've also said that the stigma that is attached to being a hypocrite is going to make people less hypocritical. The reality is that we don't think that this is going to happen. We think hypocrisy is still wrong on either side of the house, and the stigma is not changing people to be less hypocritical right now. These hypocrites are still being hypocritical. And also on the other side of the house, they're not changing the status quo. The world is still absolutely appalling as it is with this rampant cancel culture, and they haven't suggested any ways to change this, whereas we can show that we're going to end this people being ruined for one small mistake or even a bigger mistake. This is just lack of forgiveness, and these people will still have consequences for the actions. We're not removing the consequences, we're removing the stigma. One point which was thrown about a bit is that they've said that people, this isn't realistic, people aren't going to have to be hypocritical to survive. This is not only, when we came up with this point, we used warfare as an example. This is not only what we're saying that sometimes a situation may force you to do something which others would view as hypocritical, and they've just taken that example and said, oh, well, this is not really realistic. Really, they've ignored our whole point. So we believe we've won on that. And finally, they shortly mentioned youth, that they'll have healthier friendships. They said that people won't get away with being a bad person. These are not bad people. These are all kinds of people. And people who are hypocritical, these consequences are going to happen anyway, and for their actions. And for instance, with young people, their friends, parents, or teachers may talk to them. They're not going to have this massive stigma attached, like, oh, you hypocrite, though. And also, they mentioned bad mental health, which is a little bit hypocritical. Bad mental health. What about this unnecessary stigma attached, this attacking of people? I believe the other team just wishes to ruin people's lives for small actions, and that we've proved that our world is better because people will be able to be hypocritical when they need to, but they also that people will be more open-minded and willing to change their mind, because also freedom of speech was symmetrical, but people can change their mind.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I now invite both teams to cross the floor and shake hands.
Good. I like this sweater. Thank you. I stole it off a flatmate. Did she make it? I'm not.